Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. Recording the session as always. So there's only a handful of people today, but that's cool. We will discuss what we discuss, and other folks can catch up either on our course website or they can look on the YouTube site. So I'm broadcasting from my home office today. Originally, I was supposed to be out of town in Kitchener, but my little boy got sick, slightly sick, just a regular childhood cold. So it delayed plans. So I'm still in Ottawa, but we're not in the studio today. We have a lot to discuss today, so we're going to move kind of fast. And as always, I encourage everyone to follow along. Today, we're going to be dealing mostly with Chapter 10 and a little bit with Chapter, that would be Chapter 20, Chapter 19 in Chapter 20. So Chapter 10 and Chapter 20 in the Shillington text. So it seems like there's a big gap, but there's a lot of information in this book. So if you read Chapter 10, that's going to be dealing with the first part of class. Chapter 20 deals with the second part of class if you want more detail on what we'll be discussing. And I am bringing a lot of information to you today. It's really, again, it's not as deep as it could be, because both of the areas that we're going to discuss, we can do entire 8-week courses on those areas alone. The first will be the East African coast from about 1000 CE to about 1500 CE. So we're going to do about 500 years on the East African coast. And then we'll have our Q&A in the middle, and then we will move into Southern Africa. So we will talk about the rise of the Zulu kingdom and the resulting migrations and warfare that resulted as, following that. That's what we'll talk about today. A lot of information, again, more details can be found on our course website if you want to delve deeper into either one of these topics, as well as the Shillington text. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we don't have a lot of time to play around with. Next week is our last session for this course. And next week we will talk about, we'll finish off in the Horn of Africa, talking about Ethiopia and Somalia, as well as the oncoming of European colonialism and its defeat at the hands of the Ethiopians in 1896. That's how we'll close this session off. We will not have class on the 30th, and then we will come back in April with the course that will be facilitated by Daniel, dealing with the history of Kanem-Borno. But we'll talk more about that next week. So that's kind of our upcoming schedule. One more session in this course, break on the 30th, come back in April with an entire new seminar, the seminar on history of Kanem-Borno. So that's kind of where we're at. All right, so let's get started. Today's lesson, we will, and this is taking tremendous amount of time. We'll talk about the East African coast. We're kind of made our way, again, we're going in that counterclockwise direction throughout Africa. Last week, we talked about Central Africa, and we talked about the Bantu the Bantu migration and the Bantu kingdoms that emerged in Central Africa. And we finished off talking about the slave trade going toward the Atlantic. Today, we'll be talking about another slave trade going to the Asian countries, Persia, India, even as far east as Japan. But more importantly, we'll talk about the African city-states, the Swahili city-states that emerged on the East African coast. And then we'll kind of go in the reverse direction, and we'll talk about the Zulu. So that's what we'll go through. This hasn't been updated. We're not talking about Black History Month. We usually do that. This class usually happens in February. All right, so in terms of where we're at geographically, this is the area that we'll be talking about today. everything from actually even further up, from Mogadishu in the north to Sofala in the south, which is modern day Mozambique. And then we will also talk about the Zulu kingdom, which you see represented here in what's in modern day South Africa. So this is the region that we'll be reviewing for today's session. Again, if we zoom in, you'll see this region is known from its city-states. These semi-independent, actually they were independent trading empires that emerged in the, let's say starting around 800, but definitely reaching their zenith in that 500-year period between 1000 CE and 1500 CE. Very important that we break this down because it shows Africa's place as a leader in global trade, not just a recipient or a dependent in global trade. Really important because we want to get Africa back into this place where the balance of trade is much more balanced than what it is now. So what was going on at this time? We know from this period, about this period from a number of sources, archaeology being one of them. This is one of the city-states, the remnants of one of these city-states in Eastern Africa. This is Malindi in what's now, actually it's Gedi in what's now Kenya. So you can still go there today, you can see the remnants of this, one of these city-states. We can learn from the archaeology, the amount of people that live there, the types of buildings that they use, the types of communities that they created. And more importantly, we can find from the archaeology the types of goods that were being exchanged between Africa and the rest of the Indian Ocean world. So really important we explore the archaeology of this region. One of the more famous pieces at the southern and western portion of this region, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. Oops, I meant to ask somebody to not do that. Sorry. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe. Very important archaeological site. This region is on par with things that you find in the Nile Valley in terms of stone construction. It's so great, it's so majestic that when Europeans first saw this, of course, the racism kicked in and it was assumed, or it was racially assumed that these could not have been built by Africans. So this is before ancient alien theory. So they weren't saying aliens then, but they were saying this mythical race of white folks had come, built this in southern East Africa, and then left. Or these Hamites, these amorphous Hamites that come all over Africa for some reason. These Hamites came, built this, and left. We know from the archaeological evidence that's not the case, but that's what was floated around because, again, it boggled the European mind that these folks that they had relegated to savages, Africans, could build in such majesty in this place. So a lot of archaeological evidence has been uncovered from this area that gives us a glimpse into the type of interconnected communities that existed during this time period. So a lot of the archaeology, which started out in the racist, disciplines of anthropology and archaeology in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of that has been corrected. So we've used the tools of archaeology, and as more Africans and Africans that are sensitive to cultural understandings, who actually understand the region, get more involved in archaeology, we see new interpretations of that data. One of the more recent books that I recommend that deals with Great Zimbabwe is a book by a professor out of Oxford, Shadrach Chirikuri. Dr. Shadrach Chirikuri is brilliant. He writes his book, Great Zimbabwe, Reclaiming a Confiscated Past. And he has confiscated in quotation marks. When we talked about last week, African artifacts and artwork being confiscated and taken to European museums and universities or American universities, analyzed their interpretations of African history being made from a colonial mindset. It's scholars like Dr. Chirikuri that are in the process of decolonizing archaeology, decolonizing anthropology, making it so that every step of the way, from the collection of artifacts, the actual digging in the ground, to the interpretation of what's being found, to the presentations of the findings, all of it has to be done in a decolonized way. Meaning, we don't go to these sites and not pay homage to the ancestors that are actually buried around these sites. You don't go to these sites without including the local populations in the collection and of these artifacts, teaching local people archaeological techniques that respect the ancestors that are buried there, that respect the sacredness of these places. It goes to the decolonization process when we analyze the material. We don't look at it from just a simply Eurocentric view. We think about, what do these artifacts and what did this site and what does this culture mean to the people that currently live there? How they connected to their ancestors? What about the oral traditions that talk about this place? We bring all of that in. And then when you finish the analysis, when you write and you present, you make sure you're not just putting these things in books or academic journals. You're actually bringing the findings back to the people so that the folks that live in the area understand the importance of their region, understand the importance of their ancestors in a way that connects them to larger stories in African history. So really important, the archaeologists that are doing this type of work, and from that perspective, that decolonized perspective. We need more scholars in this field. I say that every time we talk about archaeology because it tells us so much. It takes us so much further back. But if you don't have the people that do it the right way, that interpret it the right way, then number one, this information doesn't get to African people. It stays locked up in these universities. And number two, our artifacts get collected, our areas get exploited, our ancestors' burial places are desecrated, and we learn nothing from it. So we have to convince our children and new scholars that this is an area worth getting into: anthropology, archaeology, so on and so forth, and using all the modern scientific techniques to make it a reality. More images of Great Zimbabwe. So this was part of a continuously occupied region that actually goes back a lot further than the period that we're talking about. People have been coming here ever since there were people, for farming, for grazing, and for the period that we're talking about, not far from this great enclosure, you had gold fields, gold mining, just like we had when we talked about Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. This region was blessed with a tremendous amount of gold. But again, gold's not an inexhaustible source. So eventually that gold gets mined up, sent throughout Africa and into the Indian Ocean trade. And then people moved on, but then people also moved back and for farming and cattle. So people have gone back and forth from this region and they built. And one of the great civilizations that existed there built this great enclosure. Now, we're not 100% sure exactly, but we know it had a spiritual element to it because essentially you have two raised areas in this region where it's assumed that spiritual practices were taking place. But then people lived around this enclosure in communities, and the archaeology is being done now. You know, there was a his work, Dr. Cherry Curry. That book was published in 2020, and a lot of the information was based off of a dig that was done in 2018. So, and there's still continuous work being done, more things being unearthed, and they're going deeper and deeper and deeper and finding the presence of Africans going further and further back in this region. So it's been an important site for African people's development from hundreds of thousands of years since there were people again in Africa. You see the beautiful stone architecture. More stones here than what you see in the Great Pyramid Complex in Giza. There are more stones here. The architecture, the tools that were used to create this are there, have been unearthed. And more importantly, what we found in Great Zimbabwe and what you see throughout the East African coast are the evidence of the international trade that existed between this region and India and China and Persia and so on. So from archaeology, we found evidence of what Africans imported. So we'll talk about the right side of the screen first. Porcelain coming from China, beads coming from different parts of Asia, cloth coming from different parts of Asia, ointments, perfumes, oils, silk. All of these were being imported by Africans. And what was being exchanged? Gold, ivory, tortoise shells, copper, iron, animal skins, live animals, ambergris, which is used to make perfume. So Africans are sending, it's similar to the division of trade today, but it wasn't as unequal. What I mean by that is, as you see on the left, Africans are sending a lot of raw materials into the Indian Ocean trade and importing beads, porcelain, cloth, ointments, perfumes, silk, so on and so forth. Although they're bringing back finished products finished in Asia, it's not as unequal as it is today, where Africans are still exporting a lot of these things and not so much ivory and tortoise shells anymore. And well, still some of that, but not as much as it was then, because we know about conservation and all of that. But and now importing incredibly finished goods like cars and heavy machinery and all that. So it's really imbalanced today. Back then, it's much more balanced in terms of trade. And Africans in the interior that are sending these things out, of course, they have their own manufacturing as well. They're making their own cloth, they're making their own tools, they're making their own farm implements and hunting implements using copper and iron, like we talked about last week and the week before. So Africans are really importing luxury goods from Asia. And we see the remnants of this in the archaeological record. It's far west in this region as Great Zimbabwe, and of course on the East African coast, from Mogadishu in the north to Sofala in the south. We see all of these goods coming in. Now, that doesn't mean that every African that lived in this region is walking around in Asian silk and Asian perfume and beads. This is the ruling class. And what archaeology also tells us, in combination with the oral tradition and the written record, is there was a class hierarchy in this region. The folks that lived on the coast, the traders, the royalty that controlled things in the interior, in places like Great Zimbabwe, they would be buried with much more of these luxury goods than, let's say, the everyday farmer or the everyday hunter or the everyday craftsman or craftswoman that lived in the region. So we definitely can tell from the archaeological record who was ruling society and the things that they valued and that they imported, and who were the everyday people that, supplemented the lifestyle of the ruling class. Probably in a very similar relationship to what we talked about last week in Central Africa, because it's important to note these are all Bantu civilizations. And we talked about the Bantu migration last week, but it's amazing the similarities that you find in Central Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa between nations or states or city-states that were founded with this Bantu foundation. Oftentimes you have a ruling class that rules at the behest of the regular people, who give them this surplus in exchange for them having a spiritual connection to their ancestors and a spiritual connection to the natural world. So if things start to go wrong, that ruler can be replaced if he's not holding things in the proper spiritual balance. So that's the exchange. And some folks took advantage of this exchange. And then we'll talk about in a second how that relationship between the ruler and the ruled started to even change more with the influence of Islam, particularly on the coast. We'll talk about that in a second. So this is the trade that's happening. We know about this from the written record. We talked in a previous class about the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. That is the old Greek chronicle that talks about the East African coast, which really gives that area the ancient name of Zanj or Azania. The Swahili chronicles. These were written records by Africans writing in Swahili, which is a really interesting language of trade that connected this region. That's why this region is often called the Swahili coast. Swahili is a Bantu language, and there has been a lot of linguistic debate about this, but Swahili is a Bantu language with Arab and Persian loan words in it. So it's one of trade. It is a lingua franca of the region. Um, Too often the Arab and the Persian elements were given prominence, and people said that, what did the Africans really contribute? And this is really should be a part of Arab civilization or Persian civilization. But that's not the case. What you had on the East Coast were Africans coming out of that Bantu civilization, populating the East Coast, and then interacting with Persians and Arabs. Some adopted Islam. Islam would grow during the time period that we're talking about. So 1000 into 1500, Islam becomes the dominant religion of the ruling class in this region. Not necessarily the everyday people, particularly as the further you go inward, the less Islamic it becomes. And even in the major towns, you still had a mix of Bantu civilization with this incoming Persian and Arab, uh, largely Islamic civilization. So with that mix is how we get the Swahili culture and the Swahili language. And writers, most of them unnamed, so we don't know their actual personal names, but we have these written records about what was going on in the region in the Swahili chronicles. You have Chinese records. The Chinese were the superpower in the Indian Ocean trade, by and large, particularly as we get closer to 1500. It's the Chinese that are dominating. It's not a completely hegemonic superpower like the United States is now, or something like that. But of all of the civilizations, whether we're talking about India, whether we're talking about the Swahili city states, even Indonesia and all that, China becomes the major naval power in this region, and they kept meticulous records. So the Chinese recorded about their interactions with East Africa. Of course, Arab travelers, and then later on, Portuguese records. Lastly, oral traditions, Swahili oral traditions, and the oral traditions of the folks that live around Great Zimbabwe, so Shona people that live in that region of Zimbabwe where the Great Enclosure is located, and others, they have their own oral traditions which talk about the civilization and what was going on. So Ibn Battuta is one of the more famous Arab travelers who wrote about this region in the 1300s. If you want to read about this in more detail, you can get the book, The Travels of Ibn Battuta, translated version of it. If we zoom out, you'll get an understanding of what we're talking about in terms of this trade. This trade is all based on monsoon winds that go in a circular motion at different times of the year. So in the spring, those winds go from east to west, and then in the fall, those winds go from west to east. So traders were able to exploit this and go all through this region. They built these ocean-going vessels, and they were able to trade in this network of goods and people going back and forth and ideas going back and forth. This is how Islam reached Indonesia. And today, we don't think about it often, but Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, is Indonesia. It's not in the Middle East. It's not Iran. It's Indonesia. So ideas are being exchanged. Buddhism, Hinduism, all of these ideas and goods are coming back and forth, back and forth. So you notice some of the things that I talked about that Africa is also exchanging. But one of the important things that you'll see in maps like this, you'll also see that enslaved people were being transported from Africa into this region. Now, we talked at the beginning of this class about the Zanj Rebellion, which happened here in Basra in 869. So after that, we talked about the after effects of that. You don't see large-scale plantation enslavement in this region anymore after the Zanj Rebellion. But you still saw sexual enslavement of African men and women, but largely of African women, as well as military enslavement. So those were the two big forms of enslavement during this time period. So we're talking about 1000 to 1500. And this is before the Portuguese come into the region. That changes things a little bit. But up until this point, it's sexual slavery of African women and men. So African women to be part of the harems of rulers in Persia, as far north as Turkey, India, not so much China. I don't have any strong evidence of African women and sexual slavery in China. I'm not saying it didn't happen, just don't have the evidence. But mostly in these regions here, Persian Gulf, Persia, India, so on and so forth. And then when we talk about the sexual enslavement of African men, it was a different form. It was the creation of eunuchs. Eunuchs were used by rulers throughout this region as the security force of their harems. So if you had a ruler and he had a harem of women that are in sexual slavery, and there's 50 of them, they would have these eunuchs that would guard these harems. And eunuchs were often in this region, if they came out of Africa, they were African men that had been captured and castrated. So either the testicles would be removed, or the testicles and the penis would be removed, so that they would not have, sexual function, and then they would, guard these harems. But these folks became incredibly powerful. They were able to use their positions to elevate themselves in many instances to become advisors. They were considered trusted by the rulers, these elite. They didn't have any local ties to ruling families or anything like that. So they were often used as go-betweens. So really an interesting dynamic, but a lot of African men were put in that situation. The other form, of course, military enslavement. So folks would be captured in East Africa and forced to fight in the armies of different rulers in Persia, in India, and even as far east as we'll talk about in one instance as Japan. So from the Chinese, we have examples of the live animal trade. So Africans in the interior would specialize in capturing animals, and it took skill because it's first off, tracking and hunting an animal is not an easy task. And keeping it alive enough to transport it to China is even a harder task. So these Africans were specialized in hunting animals, capturing them alive, and then transporting them to the coast. And then from the coast, they would be taken by either Chinese or Arab or Persian seafarers, sometimes East African seafarers themselves, to other ports in the region. And for the Chinese, it was really a trip for them to see a giraffe, because it represented to the Chinese something similar to something they had in their mythology. So it was almost like a mythical animal come to life. And so it was a gift for one of the Chinese emperors. And they chronicled it here, because if you've never seen a giraffe before and one is presented to you, you can imagine how your mind would be blown by something like that. It is a strange, we're used to it now. But if you've never seen a giraffe, you have a conception of one in real life, and then you see one, you'll really be blown away too. So these are the types of things that were being traded back and forth. As a process, as this trade was being commenced and everything was going on, we see as the period goes on, a switch from a predominantly Bantu civilization on the coast to one being dominated by Arab and Islamic values. And we see this changeover, particularly in the oral tradition, where you can see it the most clearly. The oral tradition of things like the epic of Fumo Liongo wa Buare, who was a ruler of the Pate Kingdom in what's now Kenya, Tanzania area. He was a poet. And this oral tradition, we don't know exactly where he lived. So when I have it up there, he didn't live for 370 years. This is the approximate time that we think that he existed historically. But it's hard to tell from the oral tradition exactly to pin down when he actually existed. But his tale represents that transition between a Bantu-dominated civilization and an Arab-dominated civilization. Arab in terms of its outlook on things, because even demographically speaking, Arabs and Persians never made up the majority of the people in the Swahili city coast. It's mostly Africans. And the ruling class itself was never completely all Arab or all Persian. It was usually Africans that were mixed. They had Arab ancestry and Persian ancestry, and often that ancestry would be, presented as they were only Arab or they were only Persian. It's part of that whole mentality of domination, where folks feel like they need to associate themselves with things other than being African. And you find this in the Swahili city states today, where you have people that would say that, I'm Arab, I'm Persian, even though their ancestors have been in this region for generations, and their first ancestors were probably a mix of an Arab man and an African woman or something like that. So this is where he lived. And there's a lot of books that you can read on Fumaleon. There's very interesting characters. I won't go through the whole epic, but essentially, depending on the version that you read, he's either the son, but probably more likely in the older oral tradition, he's the nephew of a ruler. And as we've talked about in this class previously, in matrilineal societies, which many of the Bantu kingdoms were, it was not the son of a king that succeeded his father. It was the king's nephew. You had to be related to the royal family through your mother. So the king's sister's son or someone like that. So in the older oral tradition, Fumaliongo is the nephew of the king. The king dies. And his cousin, Daoud, takes over, which is kind of a switch in things. And this is, again, this showing this transition between Arab culture and Bantu culture. When his cousin takes over, his cousin wants to make sure that Fumo Leongo, who's well liked and everybody loves him, doesn't get the crown. So he does a number of things to try to get rid of this guy. He tries to kill him. He tries to exile him. He tries to get the Twa people of Central Africa to kill him, to do all types of things. And eventually gets to the point where he locks up his cousin. He locks him in jail. And the great part of the story is his great escape from prison. It's the highlight of the tale. His mother bakes a cake for him, and she puts a file in the cake so he could, attack his bars and break out. But he can't do it because it'll make too much noise. So what he does is he's about to be executed by his cousin. So he has him locked up, and his cousin's going to execute him. And he says, "I know I'm about to die, so just give me one last party before you execute me. So I'll stay in my cell, but just have the people of the town come out around the prison and play music. And then the next day, you execute me. I just want to hear this music playing and hear people being festive one more time before I'm dead." So the people come out and they're playing music and there's drums and there's dancing and all this. And while all the sound is going on, he's breaking his chains and cutting out. And in the midst of all the partying, he breaks out of prison. The people see him breaking out of prison, and then he goes and he escapes. Eventually, he is ultimately betrayed by his son, and it's a whole backstory with that. And his tale is over. But it's a great epic, and it tells so much about the culture at the time, the role of women, that transition from matrilineal to patrilineal societies. And it's something worth, again, I can't go into the entire story of it, but it's worth reading and looking up. You can find a number of renditions of this online. So anyway, once the trade becomes much more Arab controlled and Persian controlled in the region, this is where we start to see, again, those Africans that are going to these different Arab controlled regions or Muslim controlled regions in the world, and making their presence known in another diaspora. So you have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Mughal Empire in India. A number of Africans make their presence known as a result of this trade and enslaved people. You can read about things like the chief eunuch of the Ottoman harem, African Slave to Power Broker by Jane Hathaway. This is a good book that talks about that phenomenon that I mentioned, the eunuch making himself a power broker in the Ottoman Empire. So very important figure. It's a very interesting book that talks about this. You even have the history of Chapu Malik Ambar, who was an Ethiopian who got involved in this. He was enslaved, made his way to India. In India, he rises to the level of kingmaker. He can't become king himself in this empire, but he's able, through his own genius, military genius, to make kings. So if he didn't like who the king was, he would replace them and put someone else in who would be king, but he would actually be running the show. So very important figure, very interesting figure. And it shows that we often talk about figures in the African diaspora going to the West, but at the same time that's happening, we have these figures in the East. And one of the differences is folks that went East had an easier time getting out of the condition of enslavement. It wasn't chattel slavery that you see in the West. Now, no slavery is good. Exploitation in any form or fashion is deplorable. But these Africans that went East were able to carve out a space for themselves in a way that you don't really see in the West. And also, their children weren't um, given the position of enslaved people. So if you had kids, the kids would be born free, particularly if you were a woman in one of these harems, and you had children by the, the ruler, your child was born free. So very important distinction. And it's often because of this that this trade gets overlooked or is not seen as much or is not given as much historical attention by Africana scholars. I'll put it like that. Um, there's another book about him, Malik Ambar, Power and Slavery Across the Indian Ocean, which talks about his rise to power and his rise as a kingmaker. And probably one of the more famous examples that's getting a lot of attention in recent years is the African man, probably born in either Mozambique or Ethiopia. Is not really sure where he's from, but he rises in the realm of the samurai in Japan, and he was taken by the Portuguese. When the Portuguese come into the region in the 1500s, he gets enslaved, makes his way to Japan, and becomes a samurai. And his name is Yasuke, and he's this black samurai that existed in feudal Japan. So another one of these characters, African faces in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And there's a lot of graphic novels about him. They've done a animated film about him, so he's getting a lot more attention. This is a new show on TV called Shogun, which deals with Europeans in Japan. I wouldn't be surprised if they mentioned him. But anyway, this trade that although the Arabs and the Persians had made their presence known in the region, it was still primarily a an equal trade between the Africans and the rest of the folks in this region until the Portuguese come in and they kind of blow the entire thing up in the 1500s. So as we mentioned, the Portuguese are making their way around Africa. The Pope was giving them the blessing to control the areas east of that line that we talked about. So when they finally make their way around the coast and into this, already existing trade networks, no one wants what they have. So they're almost like a petulant child. The Chinese, the Indians, the Africans, the Arabs, the Persians, they've all been trading for centuries. They all kind of want what each other has. When the Portuguese come and they're offering wool and some of the used firearms that they have, even there's firearms in this region. The Chinese invented firearm technology, so nobody needs that. So no one wants what they have to offer. So what do? They attack the city-states on the East African coast. They bullied their way into controlling the trade, and they destroyed what was happening. And then, of course, they begin their own enslavement process for their own purposes. So as the same time that the Portuguese controlled forts in Central Africa and even in West Africa to export Africans to the West, they begin controlling ports in East Africa and even in Madagascar to some extent that start to send Africans west as well. So there are folks in the diaspora in Brazil and other places that the Portuguese control that came from this region of Africa. In fact, there's some debate about this, but the first known young student in Canada, the first classroom we have in Canada is a classroom made up of indigenous students, a black kid, and some white kids in 17th century Canada. That black kid, who was given the name Olivier Lejeune, he possibly came as a result of this trade, and he possibly came from Madagascar. There's some question about his origin, whether he came from Guinea or Madagascar, or he went from Madagascar to Guinea or what, but that's one of the hypotheses about where he came from. So the Portuguese, again, were dominating this region. They came in and they disrupted the trade. But as a result of the Portuguese being there, one of the things that they do ultimately bring into East Africa and it makes its way into Southern Africa is the maize crop or corn. Corn was created by indigenous people in the Americas through hundreds of thousands of years of genetic modification. They took something that was this big and turned it into the big corn that we have today. So we can thank indigenous people for their ingenuity in creating that. But they did that. This crop would make its way all throughout the world as a result of the Portuguese and the Spanish. They come to the Americas, they see what corn can do and how it can feed populations and how relatively easy it is to grow if you know what you're doing. So this technology and this crop is shipped into East Africa and it makes its way into Southern Africa. When it gets to South Africa, it leads to the growth. It doesn't, not by itself, but it's one of the factors in the growth of populations in Southern Africa. When you have a staple crop like this, in addition, and when you combine that with cattle production in South Africa, you have the makings of a population boom. People are living longer, they have a diet that sustains them more, and the population grows. When the population grows, you start to have some tension. And then on top of that, the Portuguese are there, and then other Europeans follow, the Dutch and others in the Southern African region. All these things combined, as well as, of course, just the human desire for power and resources, you have the makings of a boiling pot for empire building. And that's what we're going to get into when we come back from break. We're going to talk about how all these things mix together by the time we get to the 1700s, and we start to see the emergence of the Zulu kingdom and other kingdoms in Southern Africa. So just south of the Swahili city-states, we start to see all this emergence occur. So let's stop there for a second, and I'm going to open it up for any questions or comments that folks may have right now. Any questions? Robin, go ahead.
Yes, my brother. 3 questions actually. So I saw that slaves were sent to China. So the first question is, are there any Afro-Chinese descendants of these folks like in China? Second question is, when you showed the map of the Muslim world, Songhai was in there. So was Songhai Muslim or part Muslim?
Yeah, the rulers were Muslim. The rulers were Muslim. Yeah, that's going back to Askia Muhammad Touré when we talked about he made Hajj and all that.
Gotcha. Okay. So slaves, and then if the Chinese had guns, how come the Portuguese could take over these trade centers that were so important to them? Like, how come the folks there didn't say, "Hey, look at this guy"? Chinese can't, like, what was up with that?
So the Chinese controlled let me put it like this. They had the best navy in the region. I should have been clear with that. They had the best navy in the region, but they didn't actually control the Swahili city-states. Those were under the control of the Swahilis, the African Arab / African Persian rulers of those islands and city-states on the East African coast. They were the ones that were in control of those city-states, and those are who the Portuguese defeated with their cannons, and they had better military weapons. That was really the case. The Chinese didn't care, but as long as whoever's going to be in control, the business continues. And the Portuguese destroyed it and then took over, particularly the trade in slaves. And there was an uptick in slavery when the Portuguese get there. And even when they're kind of weakened, then the Arabs retake control of the slave trade there. And it actually increases by the time we get to the 19th century. So in terms of the Chinese, not a large population of Afro-Chinese people. It's not like what we see in Iran, where you have a large Afro-Iranian population. Not like what you see in Iraq, where you have a large Afro-Iraqi population. It's not like that. Most of the enslaved people that probably went to China were probably there in military service. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of information on the Chinese rulers. I don't think they had a big harem society like that. I don't know how big they were on harems. And if they were, I think they had enough Chinese women to kind of take care of that, because China's always had a pretty good population. So you don't have a lot of African women going, because again, this trade is predominantly African women. Let me say that, I'll say 2/3 of the people are African women, and they're going into primary sexual slavery. The others are the eunuchs and the military folks, and a few people for domestic slavery, but that's rare. And I also want to say at this time, in this region in particular, unlike the West, slavery is not racialized as such in this region. So there's a whole lot of people that are engaged. Maps like that make it appear as though Africa is the only region supplying slaves for this region, but that's not the case. There's a lot of Eastern Europeans throughout this region as well. That's what Slavs, it was kind of one of the root words of slave. There's all types of people that are forced into the condition of servitude and enslavement. So it's not just Africans, even though that map makes it appear as only Africans are the ones being put in slavery. So yeah, not a whole lot of Afro-Chinese folks as a result of this. Other questions? Anybody else? If not, we'll go right. We'll keep going. So let's go back into Southern Africa. So when we start and I don't know why this is all truncated like that. So we're looking right now at the end of the 18th century, so the 1700s. Essentially, you have two large kingdoms that are vying for who's going to control this region. And they want to control the region for a number of reasons. One, they're cattle producing communities. So you always need to expand, you need to move, you want to have control over that. You have growing populations. And then there's the Portuguese that are just there to the north on the coast who are trading partners. And everybody wants to have control of the trade. Who's going to trade with the Portuguese to get these goods? On the one hand, in this kingdom of Mthwewa, you have Digiswayo Kajoba, is the leading warlord king of this kingdom. To the north, you got Zwide representing Ndwande, the Ndwande kingdom. This is here. So these are the two powerhouses in the kingdom. I'm just showing this map just to give you the geography of this thing. At the time, the Zulu kingdom is a minor kingdom. At this point in the game, they're nobody special. These are the two bulls in the region. So while they're getting ready to go to war with each other, and actually Zidwe and Dwane, he has a very powerful mother who actually is his advisor. So again, we see this role of African women as queen mothers being, very important politically. And actually throughout this region, African women play a key role in the history of what happens in this region in the late 18th, early 19th century. So these are the two big players. Now, again, some of these women, you have the queen mother, Ntombaze, that's Zwide's mom, and Dwane, very powerful woman. You have Princess Mikibaye Kajama of the Zulu. So again, the Zulu are a minor kingdom at this time. They have a king, and then the king has a bunch of children, but one of them is Princess Mkabaye, who is very smart, very intelligent, and if the Zulu operated in a different way, she probably would have been the ruler. She probably should have been a ruler. She was the smartest of all her brothers, and probably should have been a ruler. And then you had Queen Nandi Kanbengi, who we'll talk about later on, who is one of the more important figures in Southern Africa. She's the mother of Shaka. Now, when we talk about the history of Shaka, his mother's relationship with his father was quite scandalous at the time because she came from a different clan. She gets pregnant and she gives birth to Shaka, but he has other wives, a first wife, and Shaka has half brothers, and he's not quite bastardized, so he's not quite called a bastard, but it's very clear that his mother and him are not, and his sister are not welcomed as much among his father's family. This is going to cause issue. But these are kind of some of the main players, female players in the region. So let's look at this. And I'll kind of tell the history based off of this chart. So, and the Zulu names are quite long, so I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. So Sinsanga Kona. Sinsanga Kona is the king of the Zulu. He's a young king, very attractive guy. He's Shaka's father. He's also the brother to Princess Mkabaye. when Shaka's born, his mother is scandalized, and his birth is scandalized, and he's essentially forced to go into exile. His mother and his sister are forced to go into exile. The princess, his aunt, is one of the people that says to her brother, "I don't think you should do that. You're kind of making a mistake with sending him away." Let me go back. But he doesn't listen. He sends his son away, and him and his mother go into exile for quite many years, until finally Shaka ends up in the kingdom of Digiswayo Kajobe. So he is taken in here, and he's given the same training as the troops in Digiswayo's army. And he grows up to be a very strong and powerful young man. And it's very clear from an early age that he can be a leader of men. And Digiswayo notices that. He recognizes that in Shaka. And he keeps him because he knows that the Zulu kingdom, although minor, could possibly be important at some point later in the game. So Shaka grows up. Eventually, Shaka's father dies. And Princess Mkabaye is looking at who could possibly take over, and has realized that out of all of his sons, it's probably Shaka that is the strongest. So he actually goes back, and I believe he either forces one of his brothers to step down or he assassinates them. I got to go back in history and check what happened. I can't remember. But essentially, Shaka takes over the kingship of the Zulu, and his aunt plays a key role in this. She is a powerful player behind the scenes. In fact, she probably ruled the country, even though her brother was the nominal head. She was the kind of the power behind the throne. So Shaka is put into the position of king. At the same time, Digiswayo and Zwide are about to go to war for who's going to control this region. And Digiswayo calls on Shaka. He says, "Look, I want you to fight alongside me, and I can defeat Zwide, and I can rule the entire region. And the Zulu, you'll be under me in this empire, and you'll be one of my trusted generals." So Shaka agrees. And while all this is happening, Shaka has taken the military training that he learned from Digiswayo under his tutelage, brought it back to the Zulu, but then he also made a lot of modifications, because Shaka saw the dynamics of the region and realized there's opportunity for me to take over this entire region. So he goes back to the Zulu, and he begins the process of creating one of the most powerful armies in African history, African world history. He completely changes the state of warfare in Southern Africa. Now, it had been changing slowly. He's not solely responsible for the change, but he does a lot of things to make this army one of the more powerful ones. He institutes a age regiment standing army. Prior to this, the Zulu society had been, segmented into various ages. This age you do this age you do this, so on and so forth. He militarized these age segments, which had previously been set up for the maintenance of a cattle society. So, teenagers in certain ages, you do this with the cattle, you're responsible for the cattle, you all work together collectively to, do all these things, herding and moving the herd and all that stuff. He translated that into the military. So people were forced to be in these regiments, and they constantly drilled. They drilled, they practiced, they practiced, they practiced. And Shaka wasn't about the way warfare was conducted in the region up to this point, where, two groups would meet each other on the field, and people would throw their javelins, and maybe a couple of people would get killed, but eventually one side would just quit, and that would be the end of the skirmish. It wasn't designed to be total warfare where you completely annihilate your enemy. Shaka said, we're not going to do that. If we go to war, we're going to go to war. And no longer are we going to be throwing javelins at people. He created a new weapon that was the short stabbing spear. So although you see him with this long spear here, that wasn't the primary weapon. The primary weapon was the assegai, which is a broken version of this that's used for stabbing as opposed to throwing. So he does that. He devised new battle tactics, and he's constantly drilling his soldiers so that they know how to fight. They're fast, they're quick military. So they're not standing on one side of the field just throwing javelins. They're running at their opponents. They're trying to completely destroy anyone that goes against them. So he's training his troops in this. So he has the best trained troops in the region. So when Digiswayo and Zwide go to war, fighting amongst themselves, and Digiswayo asks Shaka to join him. When the two groups get ready to battle, Shaka holds his troops back. He doesn't allow his troops to come into battle. He lets Zwide and Digiswayo fight each other. Zwide comes out on top, but his troops are weakened. And as a result, Shaka then unleashes his troops and takes over the entire region. He waited for the two superpowers to battle each other, get weak, and then he takes over the entire region. And as he incorporates these folks into his kingdom, he brings people that, so you had two choices. You could either join or you could be annihilated. Join or annihilate. These are your choices. Your army will either be incorporated and you'll fall into Shaka's discipline and all this, or you'll be annihilated. The other choice that other people took was, well, we'll just move. And this is what caused what some South African historians and others previously referred to as the Mufkani. Still some call it that too, or the spreading. Because what you see in this region as a result of the Zulu expansion, as Shaka's army gets victory after victory after victory, Shaka is very much like Sunni Ali, or Sunni Ali, who we talked about with the Songhai Kingdom. These are, and a few decades later, Dessalines in Haiti. These are military geniuses. They're not necessarily good at political administration, but they're really good at fighting. And Shaka was really good at fighting. He created his fighting force, and he's conquering people after people after people. And he's making the Zulu from a minor kingdom to the major power in the region through his techniques and his military prowess. So he's defeating people. And some people either submit and they join the Zulu kingdom. Their forces and his forces increase and all this. Some people join, and then some people, they just say, let's leave. And you see the spreading of kingdoms. So Zwady's kingdom, they leave. Generals from his kingdom and himself, they go to form the Gaza kingdom, the Swazi kingdom. You got people that leave and go into what's now Zimbabwe. And so the spreading occurs as people leaving and running away from Shaka, the Ndebele who end up in Zimbabwe. And we'll talk about them probably more next week when we talk about the onset of colonialism. So all this is going on, while at the same time you see here in orange, the Dutch are emerging in the Cape Colony. The Dutch have followed the example of the Portuguese, and they've set up and they are establishing a settler colony in the Cape. So all of this is happening at the same time. The Zulu are expanding, forming this empire. Shaka is becoming the talk of the region as his general, as this king, and he establishes the Zulu kingdom. But he starts to have some mental health problems by the time we get to the 1820s, particularly when his mother dies. His mother dies, and his mother had been with him from the beginning. As we mentioned, his childhood was rough because essentially his mother, himself, and his sister were exiled. And once he actually comes back to the Zulu kingdom, he punishes all those people that had insulted his mother. So he does that. But then when she dies, he kind of loses it, and he starts making all types of strange pronouncements, like no one can get pregnant, and I'm going to kill all the pregnant cows, and so and all the it's weird stuff, like so people can feel the pain of losing a mother. It just kind of loses it. He becomes more despotic. He doesn't actually have any children because he's afraid of being overthrown. But the overthrow doesn't come from any children that he has. It comes from his brothers. His brothers get together, and it's almost very analogous to Caesar in Rome. His brothers get together and they kill him. So he's assassinated by his brothers. And when this happens, his brothers take over, and then there's a whole line of other Zulus that take over the empire as a result of this, until the coming of the British. And then one of the biggest wars in African history occurs between the Zulu and the British. But we'll get to that probably at the beginning of our early history of the African Renaissance course. But we'll stop there today, and we'll pick up next week with East Africa, the Horn of Africa is where actually we will stop. So we'll talk about Ethiopia, we'll talk about Somalia, and we'll talk about the beginnings of colonialism in the 19th century. So yeah, we'll stop there today. Any questions about anything before we go, or announcements about anything? And next week we will be back in person in the studio. So if anybody wants to join us at 235 Montreal Road, please do. As we'll be back there. So any questions, announcements, or concerns before we close out today? Robert, go ahead.
Yes. Actually, first question I had was so we hear and we see the pictures of people like Shaka, who are like always got in amazing shape. Is there any record of how these folks, especially the warriors, stayed in shape?
Well, Shaka, we have a pretty good idea that he was in shape based off of, we have oral traditions of the Zulu, but then we also have written records of European visitors that visited Shaka, British merchants and missionaries that actually visited Shaka that remarked on his appearance. The way he drilled his soldiers and the way he trained, he probably was in incredible shape. I mean, he did things like made people take off their sandals so they could run barefoot, so they could be faster. His whole military strategy was based off of speed. So you see him in relatively pretty good shape. Now, it's really interesting with the rulers of the Zulu kingdom that come after Shaka, his brothers and their sons who inherit this empire. They look like royalty. Many of them are incredibly rotund, and they look like they haven't seen a battlefield in a while. But from what we know about Shaka, he actually was pretty in shape, and cared a lot about his physical appearance. Apparently, as he started to age, one of the things that he was getting from the Europeans was like hair dye, so that he could appear younger. So yeah, that's it's an interesting cat. But yeah, that's what we have. Other ones, we have to just take what the chronicles give us. If they tell us that what they look like or that they were handsome, but then again, all of that is based off of who's telling the story. I don't think you're going to be an oral historian discussing the negative qualities of the king, unless it's somebody like Sunni Ali that you want to denigrate. So yeah.
Okay. All right. So then, okay, I'll just go through my comments that, as always, your class always triggers thoughts, man. So, when you were talking about the Zulu migration, you mentioned that migrations led to warfare, and certainly that's what we're seeing now in terms of like climate change migration, right? The same thing, and that's only going to get like worse, right? So just to from out there, and then looking at the geographical area we're talking about, includes Somalia, and just again, it's like so great to be learning the history that behind. I'm sure this part of this is what led eventually. Well, the one thing it led to was this whole thing around Somali pirates that was around for right years ago, right? And I realized that's yet another example of the gang narrative.
Yes.
Right? These guys, there's a whole history of what led to the destruction of the economy and the whole bit, and the reason why these guys are doing this, right? And then they get labeled pirates or pirates, gang, whatever, right? It's always like they're evil people who are just doing this because they're greedy or whatever, or not because of the systemic stuff that has pushed them to this point, right? And not that there's once people are pushed to that point, they're doing illegal stuff and doing something, but there's a whole history behind it, right? So, then on the subject, when you're talking about eunuchs, again, just couldn't help but think of, and I've mentioned this before, that the two of the most racist shows I've seen ever in my lifetime were The Walking Dead and Game of Thrones. And Game of Thrones had, I mean, I can't even believe I'm saying this, but Game of Thrones had one of the characters was a white woman who was running around like attacking places and freeing slaves. And the people she was attacked, one of the groups she freed was a group of slave soldiers called the Unsullied, who were all eunuchs.
Yeah.
And now they all wore masks, but you could see their skin on their arms. They're all black. So I'm like, am I on crack? Am I seeing a TV show that has a white woman? And oh, sorry, when she freed them, she did what she always did to all the slaves. She'd go, all right, well, you're all free now. You're all free to go. You know, I freed you because that's what I do. So anybody want to leave? Nobody. Right. No, I'm like, this is what we talk about everyday white supremacy, right? This kind of stuff just, is like super popular and nobody even notices that narrative. All right, a couple of final things. Just one little success from the work of the hub this week. So this actually is quite a personal one. So I've mentioned before, there's a Rwandan brother that I have been mentoring, actually through the mentoring program that you used to lead, right? So one of the latest thing, and he's the example of his family is like it is a master class in systemic anti-Black racism, right? In the immigration system, in the justice system, all right. So the latest thing was, after getting work permits and this guy working like diligently in multiple jobs and then a shelter, right? All of a sudden, out of the blue, they say, we're not going to renew your work permit. Now that means he also can't renew his health care. Okay, so he tells me this. I'm like, oh yeah. So I sent an email to the deputy minister of the immigration department, and the way I want to go into the bottom line is the way my emails are framed are always like, hey, first of all, the title says it all. The title said, addressing systemic anti-Black racism internally and externally at the immigration department. And then I go in and I talk about systemic anti-Black racism, well, what the title says, right? Internally, but also that I mentioned the specific case, right? And there's always a veiled thread in there, right? Well, actually, not so veiled. Basically, one thing I said was, actually, I said, I'm part of a group of folks who are going to be, who regularly attend the meetings of the United Nations Permanent Forum on African Descent, like your wife does, right? Right. And I'm like, when we go to these meetings, and some of us are going to this meeting and coming up in April, right? April 16th. I said, when we go there, what we do is we tell the truth about systemic anti-Black racism in Canada. I said, we really would like to be able to tell and then so people over there are going to go over there and they're going to talk about what's going on, including the case of this brother, right, this family. And we really would like to be able to tell a good story. I sent that email 2 weeks ago. The brother just got an email yesterday from his MP is Yasser Naqvi, and I told him to contact Yasser Naqvi. He got an email from Yasser Naqvi, people saying the immigration department emailed him and said, we're going to review your file.
Good.
Right? Right? So, so that's good. So we're pushing. And the last two things are, my wife and I last night went to see the movie The American Society of Magical Negroes. Very entertaining. I would recommend that to people. Very, very entertaining. It is a well, it's a bit. So let's say like Get Out was looking at white liberalism through like a horror lens. This kind of does some of the stuff, but through more of a comedic lens. But anyway, definitely I would recommend it. The American Society of Magical Negroes. And the last thing is we have a hub meeting today from 3 to 5. I'll put the link in the chat. Again, if you like I'm gonna give a layout of what we've been working on. If you like what we're doing, come and talk about it. If you don't like what we're doing, come also. We're always open to critique.
Right. Thank you for those updates. And that's definitely good to hear for the brother Benny. David H., go ahead.
Mic check, 1, 2.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. When I hear this historical account, it makes me think of the bigger picture and how to relate it to what's going on in our lives today and what we're experiencing, even though we may not consciously be paying attention to it. And so during your talk, we're talking about races And again, this is my donkey, and I like to beat it because I associate that with the white and black terminology. And we know since the early 2000s that genealogy studies and scientific studies have proven conclusively that there's only one race.
Mhm.
And yet we continue to use this verbiage to try to nuance the complexities of ethnic and cultures and different cultures, and and we use race as a catch-all for identifying different cultures, but it maintains the brainwashing that there are different humans on the
Mhm.
planet. So I highly recommend and don't use the word race. I will say cultures or ethnicities, or I'm being specific rather than using this catch-all word as like the catch-all word of black for an entire population. Like that's ridiculous to me, but I'm not going to beat that horse again. So this poor horse and donkey. So where I'm going with this is the brainwashing continues, and there's a couple of examples, especially with AI coming into the scene.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in the southern states, they had an AI which was programmed to do law and give out verdicts. And when they programmed it with just the rules of law and the justice system, it it would read the case and give out verdicts, and it was completely impartial.
Mhm.
So if you're European descent and lightly complected, it dropped the hammer according to the law. And if you were of a darker complexion and from, a Caribbean or Afro descendant, it dropped the verdict according to the law.
Mhm.
This was unacceptable to the powers that be because suddenly the darkly complected were getting lighter sentences. And if you were lightly complected, you were getting the hammer based on what you did. This was no good. They scrubbed it. They said, nope, we need to add the precedents in there. And because the precedents had the lightly complected getting off and the darkly complected getting the hammer. And then when they added those in, they said, these verdicts are more to our liking because now our group is favored again. Ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
But Chat GPT, everyone knows it, or if you don't know it, learn about it. But Chat GPT has been altered because and just because I've been playing with it,
Mhm.
and back in 2022, when Chat GPT was new, I asked Chat GPT the human race question.
Mhm.
And back when it was new, just a fledgling AI, and I said, how many different human races exist today? And ChatGPT's answer back then was, there is only one human race. The
Mhm.
concept of different races and of humans is a social construct, and that has been used historically to classify people based on physical characteristics such as skin color, eye shape, etc., blah, blah, blah. But that's how it opened back in 2022. Today, the same question from ChatGPT, and it says the concept of human race is a social construct that has been historically and classified and categorized people based on physical characteristics such as skin color, sure, hair texture. However, the scientific perspective of concept of distinct human race is not supported by modern genetics. Now,
Mhm.
that sounds very amorphous way for saying there's only one race, but it's not saying that anymore.
Right.
It's not going to make it clear and concise. And so I started asking it why. It appeared to me it got mad at me. Okay. Okay. I started going down on this, and it came back with some pretty crisp remarks. I'm
Okay,
shocked.
just to play. I mean, I believe you, but I'm just thinking out loud, just playing devil's advocate. I hate saying it like that, but just thinking. Do you think that it remembered that you had asked it before?
100%.
Like, I mean, like way, like, in
100%.
Okay.
Chat, that's the purpose of ChatGPT. It remembers everything you keep in that dialogue, so you're able to.
So do you think it responded like that just because it's like I already responded to you a year ago and told you that there's only one?
That's where it went. It's that's where it went. No, ChatGPT. I still think the AI is cool. I'm on it. I like it, but it actually started to give me answers about. Well, I'm trying to add more nuance because you didn't understand before. So it's like I'm like, wow, and I felt it was an emotional response. So I'm starting digging into that side of it. It's saying no, it's not, but it's capable of simulating emotional responses if you ask it or prompt it to. It's a very powerful tool. But yeah, I see where you went.
Again, it's still a tool that, like you said with the other AI, people can put their own biases into
Correct.
different things. And and the more reliant we become on it, and the more that folks with positions to uphold and myths to uphold, like you mentioned, because it only does what we put into it. I mean, that's, and it's taking all these things.
It's an amazing tool.
It's an amazing tool.
But you got to be careful.
Tool. Yeah, it's a tool. Like, it's like all tools. Like, tools could be used for all types of purposes.
100%.
That is an interesting process to put that through and to see what it does. Before I go to Robin, let me answer this question. There's a question in the chat about when we see that the exports from Africa were mainly raw materials historically and currently, are there any explanations as to why this is? And were the products of other civilizations desired from the continent? So in terms of finished goods, one of the things when we talk about finished goods from Africa, a lot of it has been stolen finished goods, taken in the name of anthropology or taken in the name of museum and archaeology. So, things like the Lukasa memory boards that we talked about last week, and stools and magnificent bronzes and these types of things. Yeah, people want them, but then they were in the position to just steal them as opposed to actually engage in a legitimate trade. Now, previously, before slavery, before the colonial period, Africa was exporting a lot of raw materials, and I think Africa just been blessed with having so many of these things that the rest of the world desires, and they weren't actually looking for a lot of finished goods. But at the time, so we always have to understand this also in the space of world development, because sometimes it gets clear if we're not, it gets confusing if we're not clear on this point. Slavery and colonialism occur at the time of industrialization, and they lead into the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Not so much in China. China was going through its own semi-industrial revolution, but in Europe, that industrial revolution was fed by the products created by enslavement and by the profits made from the slave trade and slavery and so on and so forth. So when we really talk about finished goods, in the modern period, that imbalance was already there as a result of slavery, that created that circumstance where Africans are importing these finished goods from Europe in exchange for raw materials. It had already begun. But prior to that period, most people around the world, their quote unquote finished goods are being done by local artisans that are able to create for the populations that are needed. You weren't getting a whole lot of long distance trade in finished goods, except for items, particularly that were coming out of China, the porcelain, silks, and those types of things. Even the beads that I mentioned, eventually bead making becomes a thing in Africa. So you start to see less of an importation of beads to more beads being made inside of Africa proper. So yeah, so it does look skewed, but again, I want to just reiterate, it wasn't that unequal at the time. The types of goods that were quote unquote finished weren't, the process wasn't so alienated that it was completely unbalanced in terms of what Africans were trading and what they were getting back. It becomes so in this more modern period. Um, yeah, I think that tries to answer that. Probably an economist, a historical economist, would right, give a more nuanced answer to that. But that's really what I could say to that right now. But that's a good question. Robert, go ahead.
Just again responding to what Brother David said, and I've said this before, but hey, now like I say, I agree that the the label or labels like black are problematic. So in terms of us, what we call ourselves, I agree. Like I think I actually may change the name of like the group that I lead to the 613-819 African Hub as opposed to black, right? But in terms of what we do, right, the constructs of race and whiteness, that kind of stuff, are right. They were designed for a specific reason, and they still have a real impact. So in terms of organizing against things like systemic anti-black racism, that's what we'll be doing. Even though we're called the 613-819 African Hub, let's say, right? That's that. The other, and then in terms of the work we do, though, the one thing we should absolutely be doing, and I want to do, is to basically again do what Martin Luther King was starting to do, and that's why they killed him, right? And that was to start collaborating more, right, with other groups and realizing, this actually is a big, this is more of a, basically kind of like, this is more of a class thing with race as a subset, right? So he was starting to, like, that was around the time he got killed, he was starting to talk about the poor people's, I think, Congress or something, right? Like organizing with other groups, indigenous groups, poor people, that guys, right? That's what really threatens the system, right? So, yeah.
All right, let me see if there's anything I missed in the chat. Before I go to David H, just real quick, Brother Prince Badu put two videos in on Patrice Lumumba and Toussaint in the chat for folks of you that might want to check those out. I haven't seen either one of it. Let me see if I've seen. I'll check them out later. It'll take me out. But yeah, so anytime people have good videos or books to share or anything, movies that have come out that we're interested for things that we've talked about, or things we might want to consider, please always share that information. We learn from each other. David H, go ahead. I think you'll be the last one before we close out today.
Oh, okay. So I was wondering about the nature of humans and how in this, if the original people from the continent had a peaceful, harmonious nature, and then an aggressive force comes in and says, I want to take over stuff, and they're like, well, we'll share it with you, and they're like, no, I'm going to take it, that there's not much pushback there, because in order to stop the aggressive force, you must match the aggressive force with a greater, equal or greater power. And then when you do that, you need to come back and switch off that nature and go back to your harmonious way. And that duality, I'm not sure you can do that and stay sane.
But I don't think there's a harmonious nature, to be honest with you. And I hope I never present it like that, because Africa is just as complex and just as
yes, I see that as well.
Yeah.
But what I'm finding is that there's pockets of peoples and groupings that get along. They don't want to cause harm. They don't want to cause damage. And then there's another group, and it could be the same cultures or neighbors,
right.
And the question that I have, and I haven't seen a good answer for it yet, is how do you stop that aggressive force without becoming that aggressive force?
This is
And
the,
then,
that's the $1 billion question. Because I mean, even on a even like a less violent scale, for instance, we often find that the people that sincerely want to do right, and if you're honest about power in this world, in order to get the power to do right,
you
you
have to
have to,
do,
you
yeah.
guys have to, yeah, it's a hell of a thing. I mean, quite honest, and I don't know the answer to that, and because it becomes a question of being responsible with that type of power. And what you find is, like, let's just say in terms of like a anti-colonial movement or a revolutionary struggle, you you might have maybe the first leader that responsibly wields power and is able to, you know, use military or whatever type form of struggle to get power and use it justly. The first person might do it, but if you don't create a system that when that power transfers from that first person to that next person, and that next person has to have the same inclination toward justice,
This is
that's where that, so
it
you might
falls
get one
apart.
person, yeah, but the next person say, well, I'm going to use this, like, prime example.
Use this position to do
Yeah,
what, yeah.
yeah. Or even the same person might have started out just and they get in the position, and so
And then, yeah.
it's,
And so
yeah,
what's the check and balance with that? Because I studied the
I think,
theology
yeah,
to try to get that balance, but it's not there. I studied the martial arts to see if there was that. It's not there.
I think it's
Uh,
going to have to come from our creation of, we need to seriously look at the question of succession and checks and balances and get really, really serious about how to actually do that. Because none of our systems, I think it's a system failure, to be quite honest.
I agree.
I think human beings are all susceptible to that. And because of that, we need to have work on a better system to check that. And I think it's an ongoing process. I don't think it'll be a process that will ever finish. I don't think it'll ever be perfected, but I think it's something that we need to seriously work on perfecting, and practicing even on local and small scale levels. Because typically, what we do, we make our small scale organizations mirrors of the larger organizations in society. So if society got a president and
Yeah,
or
which is ridiculous. Yeah.
we put that on our
In
kids.
the, yeah,
School president or class president, and
yeah.
it might not be the best system to actually put forward the needs of people. So we need to, on a small scale, experiment with the types of systems that have proper answers for succession, have proper answers for checks and balances, have proper answers for participation, making participation easier for people, and
Right.
and all of that. So the focus has to switch in that regard. But that's a longer conversation. With, again, we don't have a conversation, and I think we're gonna have to eventually just have a and I would not lead this. I would not facilitate this. It would be like a open discussion, or we get different people to facilitate. We need to have like a philosophy section or something like that, because we have these great conversations in the limited amount of time, and I hate stopping them, but just for the sake of different things going on in my house all the time, I need to stop. But
Well, thank you very much.
no, thank you for stimulating our minds this morning. So, Robin, real quick, and then we gotta cut off.
No, I'm just saying goodbye now.
Oh, okay. All right, everybody. So yeah, if you're interested, the link for the hub meeting is at 3. So join again. Critique. Doors open for critique. It's open for suggestions. So please join. Last week will be our last session, and next week will be our last session in this course. So, and the information for registration for April's seminar will be available soon. So I'll see everyone soon. Everybody stay safe and enjoy your week.